Welcome everyone to today's webinar on identity and access management, a practical guide for the busy cybersecurity professional, sponsored by Frontegg and powered by DZone. Today, the world of authentication is very different than in years past. Users want fast, convenient access to their data, and they demand exceptional security. And thanks to technology and evolving standards, SaaS companies no longer need to make the same compromises between great UX and great security like they did in the past. Today, we're going to dive into the world of authorization and access management with an in-depth discussion specifically tailored to cybersecurity professionals. You'll see why businesses with great user management strategies today will become the industry leaders of tomorrow. My name's Jesse. I'm the Chief Technologist here at DZone. I'm super excited to introduce our experts from Frontegg. Welcome, guys. I think we have Hunter.
Yeah.
Success. Glad to have you here. And Taylor, Senior Developer Relations Engineer. Super excited to have you all here and ready to hear what you guys got to say. So I'm going to jump off and I'll be back at the end. Take it away.
Thanks, Jesse. Awesome. Thanks for watching, folks. We're here today to talk to you about identity and access management. Heard the title already. So as he mentioned, my title is Senior Developer Relations Engineer. I work for a company called Frontegg. Here to speak to you with Hunter. Hunter.
Hey guys, so yeah, I'm Hunter. I'm head of success over here at Frontegg, also repping the swag today. Essentially, hey, nice shirt. Long story short, when we talk about Frontegg, we're talking about user management for customers and identity access management, how your users are logging in, what types of roles, permissions, authorization they're using, login box, admin portal, all these different features that you need as a SaaS company to kind of get off the ground, or as a more developed SaaS company that you may have done yourself at one point and now you need someone to take care of it for you, because as we're going to get to, authorization and authentication gets more and more complex as a company scales. So Frontegg handles all of that from A to Z. And if you're interested in more, we'll probably plug some links at the end, but you guessed it, it's just frontegg.com. So we won't talk too much about the company. We're going to focus a little bit more on identity and access management today, what that looks like for cybersecurity. But if you're interested, please feel free.
Awesome. So the reason we chose this topic today is actually because it's very relevant with things that are happening right now. And specifically it's because authentication is improving pretty rapidly. So this was actually on May 3rd. And this is Google saying goodbye to passwords because they're moving towards new authentication mechanisms. So in terms of just the way that these new technologies are proliferating into the tools that you are using, your customers are using, things are changing pretty rapidly. So we thought that this would be a good topic to kind of drill down into a little bit more deeply. So we're going to go through a few different topics. We're going to cover some foundations of identity and access management, some standards and compliance. We'll talk about the state of the world when it comes to IAM tech, and we'll talk about how to develop your strategy, how to scale your strategy, and then we have we'll go through some questions together. So I'm going to start with the basics of identity and access management. And a good place to start is what we actually mean by authentication. So if, for example, Hunter had a clubhouse and I wanted to get into that clubhouse, I might have to know
it's very exclusive
in order to get into the clubhouse. Now, I have to give that secret handshake in order to get in so that he knows that I am allowed in there. But there's also other ways that he could keep his clubhouse safe. Maybe the quality of his secret handshake could be different. Maybe he could have a list of people that is allowed in the club, which would be similar to authorization. Maybe he could define some special permissions. So I'm allowed in, but I'm not allowed to drink any water. He could also he could add a knocking policy so that he would be able to check and see who it is before they came in, which is kind of similar to MFA. But these mechanisms, what they do is they help you build trust in your user's identity. And it's important to make that distinction because you can't really prove your user's identity. You can only increase the belief that they are who they say they are. So when a computer is trying to prove your identity, it has to prompt the user for information. And historically, how that's been done has very much been around usernames and passwords. Now, passwords are passwords are pretty problematic. Most of the breaches that you probably hear about nowadays are a result of passwords being hacked. There's a website called haveibeenpwned.com where you can see whether your credentials have been compromised. So this happens a lot. It's generally very high risk. It's also not a great user experience. Besides remembering the passwords, you can forget them. You have to have mechanisms in place to help them retrieve their passwords. But what the password is achieving is helping the app build trust in that user's identity. But that can also happen through other mechanisms. So things like a PIN code, where a user enters a PIN number. Now, from a user's perspective, that's pretty similar to a password. You have to remember it. Maybe you might forget it. But from a business's perspective, that's actually more secure, because they don't have a database of your PIN code stored somewhere that can get hacked the same way that passwords can. And what we have begun to move more towards is having multiple factors, which actually greatly increases the level of trust that you can have in a user's identity. And in general, MFA has seen a lot of growth and a lot of adoption. Most of you here today are probably using some form of MFA in order to access your company resources. And so as we're talking about the different content today, we're going to lean pretty heavily into the authentication piece. But now that we have a shared understanding of what that is, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Hunter here to talk to you about auth.
Yeah, so generally when we talk about auth, there are two different things we could be talking about. We might be talking about authentication or authorization. There's the auth in both of them. For the most part, when people say auth, they mainly mean authentication, right? The logging in piece. But one thing that we really wanted to make sure to add in is that it's actually a combination of both of these things. The word authorization itself, you're talking about some type of access control, right? When we talk about IAM, identity and access management, it's a huge part of this environment. So when you talk about the world of auth, it's not just authentication, but it's the combination of them, right? The authentication is who's your daddy, right? Who is this person? The authorization is what is he allowed to do, right? What can they do within the context of your organization? There's a number of different ways that organizations handle that, right? It might be from if we take it from a role-based access control, like I have a role and this is what my role is allowed to do. Maybe it's resource-based or access-based. And we'll talk about more of those specifics as we go on. But when we talk about auth, we're talking about the both of these together, because that IAM or that CIAM, right? When we're talking about our customers' identity and access control and access management, it's a combination of the identity piece and that access management.
I think for me, one of the things that really helped me conceptually think about authorization too was the term delegated access.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that really helped me understand that. And one of the things I wanted to set one of the things I wanted to add some context around was a term that you're going to be hearing a lot more of this year and moving forward, which is the idea of identity first. We won't be going too deep into this concept today, but I did want to explain what that meant so that when you hear it, when you're out looking at different tech and just navigating the IAM space, you understand what they mean by that. It frequently comes up in the context of zero trust architectures, but what identity first means can be represented by a bubble. Historically, historically, you would have identity wrapping your application, which is made up of your authorization and your authentication. And you would have this protective bubble around everything that you have for your app. What the identity first concept is introducing is the idea of having a concept of identity around each individual piece of your application. So you have your database, all of your different layers individually. And the idea is that if one is compromised, you don't have a breach and exposure for everything. It's just that one individualized piece. So when that term comes up, that is what they mean by that. It's just these individual wrappers of identity around pieces of your app. So one of the topics that's very relevant for cybersecurity is standards and compliance. And I'm going to hand it off to Hunter to tell you a little bit more about that.
So yeah, when I introduce myself, I'll just say, you may have thought to yourself, this is a cybersecurity. webinar, why are we talking to somebody who's a head of success who works with customer success? And the reason being is that when we're working with a lot of different customers in the world of access management and identity, you have to constantly think about compliance. As cybersecurity providers, I'm sure that you're very aware of things like GDPR, SOC 2, HIPAA, these different compliances that all these organizations need to have in order to work with your product or for you to work with their product. And the best thing about them is that they are bi-directional and they're for a good purpose, right? As cybersecurity companies, we're always thinking of these internal and these external threats. Who are we needing to protect our services from? And as a cybersec company, who am I doing the protecting of? And these compliances are in place to hopefully enable you. These frameworks were meant to help enable your product as like a cybersecurity product to be compliant across the board. So that way you don't have to do a different check for every single customer. But the compliance is meant to help you drive that security, right? And that's going to take place in a lot of your access control, right? And how you are encrypting a user's information. And some of the most secure information is their password, if you have it, their user credentials, any other personal data, right, about that customer. There needs to be a level of encryption, a level of data protection and requirement that's met for all of that. And at the end of the day, the user is the one that benefits from these compliances, right? They're the one who says, I have better data privacy, I'm more better protected, the integrity of my data is better, and I trust the companies keeping my data safe. So it's ultimately best for the user. And a good thing about it for access management is that you have solid audits and monitoring that get put in place by these compliances. As you may or may not know, but I'm assuming you do, oftentimes when you're going through these compliances, every single little detail, both inside and outside of your company, needs to be tracked, monitored, and written down. But that does ultimately help the trust in your company. And it makes it so you can go back and say, oh, we have everything audited. If there was a breach, we know how we can find it. We're looking at our security and we're in a pretty solid place. It's not just compliances, though. There are also standards. The standards that we have in this case are best for interoperability. What we're talking about in that case, right? SAML and OAuth are great examples when we're talking about SSO connections. So when we're talking about a single sign-on or potentially what is a more secure way to have customers log in and manage how they're logging in, manage that identity management. Some of these standards like SAML and OAuth, what they do is basically say, we want the same login standard across all parties. So that means that if I'm logging into an application via an SSO, so let's say I wanted to log in to my app is called Fido because it's on the screen, but let's say it's the dog Fido. And I wanted to log in via my SSO, which is being done with an external service like Google or Microsoft. So I want that same login that I have to be available on all of my third-party tools. So that way I can use it wherever I go. And that's going to be the same when you get to security and privacy. You're going to get better security practices because everyone's adopting the same thing. And then you can use the same standards, log in the same way, and everyone's happy when you have an ecosystem that works together. Taylor, you want to take this last part?
Yeah, I think one of the things I really like about standards is the way that it fosters just innovation and collaboration. So with FIDO Alliance, you have a very clear example of people pushing passwordless authentication mechanisms forward. And I'm a really big fan of Open API and just a lot of what it's enabled around documentation and developer tooling in general. Wanted to get into the state of the world with IAM technology. One of the important things you should know is that authorization is evolving very quickly. And one of the ways that is changing is things are moving from being more coarse-grained controls to being more fine-grained. And some of the distinctions there are that for role-based access controls, those are things that you're defining ahead of time as an administrator. You're defining groups and permissions associated with those groups. And then when users are provisioned, they are assigned to those groups, and that access is granted by the permissions associated with those roles. So each user has an assigned role. Now, on the other end of the spectrum is the attribute-based access controls, where you're defining policies based on individual attributes and possibly context. And the authorization decisions that your system is making are actually based on the policies that you're defining from those attributes. But what that does introduce is this kind of decision layer that has to happen. It has to actually look and determine whether or not that authorization is available. But it does give you a much tighter degree of control. And it also makes it so that provisioning actually happens at runtime as opposed to admin time. And the attribute-based access control is actually an area where there's a lot of tech that's kind of been emerging. There's a lot of different proprietary solutions that are available, but there's a lot of different growth around some of the open source technologies. So Open Policy Agent is a popular one. It's a very declarative way of describing things, but there's also other examples as well. So Zanzibar, there's NAST, which created the NGAC, which is probably the acronym I should have had up here, but Next Generation Access Control. These are all kind of different flavors of this fine-grained access control mechanism. So in addition to these open source libraries, you'll see a lot of different tech and tooling that's kind of built on top of them. So as you're building out your authorization layer, something to consider is, what does that ecosystem look like? How strongly do you feel about it? And the other big takeaway we want you to have here is that authentication is also evolving. Now, a good example of that is my front door. You see here I have a PIN code. I can enter a PIN and get in. I can use my fingerprint and scan it and I can get in. And I also have some verification, digital verification steps, because my dog will bark at you if she doesn't know you, but she will lick you either way. So it's ups and downs.
Love the high tech there.
And hand this off to Hunter to talk to you a little bit about the different factors.
Yeah, so when we also talk about security, particularly in authentication, Taylor mentioned before, when we're doing authentication, we can't be 100% that this person is the person they're meant to be, but we try to increase our trust in there. And there's a number of different ways that you can do that. And there are 5, 5 that we'll talk about. So the first one is something you know. This is something that you have knowledge of. Hypothetically, only you have the knowledge of it, right? A password or a PIN code. I know this knowledge, and as such, I am who I say I am. But as we know, that is fallible, right? I could tell my password to someone. It could be pwned on the internet. Someone could guess it. So there's also something you have. This is something physical. So maybe I have a card or my mobile phone where I click a button. So I have my phone on hand. That allows me to get in. Maybe I have a magic link that was sent to my email. So another level of trust. There's something you are. So something you are is not something like, I am a man or this or that. In this case, it's more like biometric data. So it's your fingerprint, facial recognition, your voice, right? Pieces of you that can be used to then increase that authentication. Some where you are. So this is location based. Maybe it's your IP address. This, of course, has been a topic amongst Netflix and streaming services for a long time. But how do we make sure that users from different areas are not trying to log in on the same account? So that's another aspect of knowing. Impossible travel is what that's called. This idea that it's not, I didn't travel across the world in the span of a second. And finally, something you do. So this might be solving a puzzle, doing a picture password, but it's another piece that you can add for that factor of authentication. So when we talk about authentication and ways that we can strengthen it, those signals, right? Hypothetically, if I'm using more than one of those, I'm going to be in, you guessed it, multi-factor authentication. The whole goal of having multiple factors, so having numbers 1 and 3, 1 and 4, is so that we increase the belief of you are who you say you are. Everyone is relatively familiar with MFA at this point. Its adoption has been increased quite a bit. So people understand that it's more secure. Sometimes for a lot of companies, that feeling is for better or for worse, that maybe I have more MFA here. I tried to log in. I need to pull out my phone and I need to add extra. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that friction as we go on in the presentation. And the something you do is also evolving. It's becoming a little bit more signal-based in a person. This is really cool. I heard about this a while ago, and also Taylor brought it up when we were making this presentation. This is typing DNA is a typing authentication. So it monitors the way that you type, and then it uses that to basically check your signal, right? Give it a score of how you're typing and see, is this the same person typing? So these are really cool ways that there's still innovation in this field being made. And it may seem like, but everyone just has a password these days, but that's exactly not the case. And a lot of the reason why we're talking today.
So to throw back to our beginning slide, what that was an announcement from Google that they are rolling out support for something called passkeys. Passkeys are a passwordless technology, and they allow users to log in without a username and password. Instead, they use private and public key cryptography. And this came about as a result of FIDO, which is this alliance creating these open standards for passwordless, collaborating with big tech. And this really started to see more traction in 2022 when Apple rolled out support for passkeys. But it is now on your Android phone, it's on your iOS. And so with companies like Google rolling out support for it with their login mechanisms, it's really seeing a lot of proliferation. And what it is it's basically enterprise level security coming down to the consumer level. And the way that you use it is something that's very familiar to people. I don't know how many of you use facial recognition on your phone, but probably most, because it's quite easy. And that is basically, that is possible to use that and log into SaaS applications because of the passkey technology. And that is a big deal because it means that there's no guessing. You can't reuse passkeys. They're resistant to phishing. They don't get stored in a database. And with it getting rolled out to these tools that you log into and everyone having mobile phones, it means that adoption is going mainstream pretty much right now. Users have already been conditioned to authenticate that way. It is very much expected behavior of using your phones. And what that looks like for setting up a new passkey, I click use passkeys. I go to set it up, select a phone, scan a QR code on my phone, scan my face, and then it gets saved to my phone as the passkey. Now, when I go to log in, I click sign in with passkey. So pretend that arrow is pointing at the right thing. Scan my QR code, scan my face, and I'm now authenticated with the application. Gonna jump here to developing an IAM strategy. Hand this back off to Hunter.
Yeah. So personally, I've worked with hundreds of different customers on setting up their CIAM strategies, right? Setting up how they're going to do their login box, their access management, passwords, password lists, passkeys, these different pieces, and they have to work together. So part of the security practice is this strategy, and there's a very specific reason that we use the word strategy, because when you make a strategy, there are certain pieces that need to be a part of it. The first one being you need to define what your access requirements are, right? So you have to decide risk versus convenience. How difficult do I want it to be to log in versus how easy maybe do I want it to be and how risky is that? Am I going to be compliant to these different standards that exist in the business? And what are my business goals? Depending on the part of my product, can this be a little bit more lackadaisical, or is this super high stakes, top tier security? The next thing you need to do is make an inventory of your users and your assets. You need to map out everything in your product that needs protection, because as we all know, it just takes one small thing to be missed to cause a big, big crisis. Once you've mapped that out, you can start to create your identity and access management policies. So that means your authentication flows, your authorization policies, how you want to have access control defined, whether that is role-based, attribute-based, resource-based throughout the application, how you want to provision or deprovision users inside of the application, and you need to document everything as a part of that to make sure that when new customers come on board, they're able to understand what they need and when and where they need it. Then you'll need to select the technology that helps you do that. Being that we are in the future right now, it is 2023. doesn't come as a surprise that you don't have to do everything yourself, right? When we talk maybe 5 years ago, I think every company was building their own piece of login box, MFA, so on and so forth. But now, because of all these standards and compliances, you can basically say, what technology am I going to use? Do I want to use SSO? What kind of SSO? Do I want to use MFA? You can consider your developer experience versus your user experience, how you're going to integrate it, how scalable that is as you get more customers integrated, and how flexible it is. And finally, that last piece of the strategy is going to be test and improve. Once you have your IAM strategy written out, sandbox it, test it, bug bash it, try all your edge cases, make sure that your data is protected and it's protected in the right place. And it hopefully does not come at the sacrifice of a user experience. And a couple questions to consider if you're going to evaluate different access management practices is if you want to start adding in a new practice, how is it going to affect your current strategy? Maybe you use passwords and you want to switch to passwordless, which is great. But maybe you use passwords with an MFA that is a passwordless. So if you want to switch to passwordless, then you also need to switch your MFA. You get the point. Are you being secure or compliant? What about changing standards, which is something that is happening just as quickly as these new technologies are coming out? Is your access management auditable? And what tools or technologies can you add that might create additional value? As a tip, we definitely say use a checklist. And as another tip, just remember, you don't have to do this all on your own. There are a lot of companies out there that are built exclusively to help you with this process. And let's go back over maybe to Taylor, because he wants to talk about his favorite thing.
Cool. +1 on the checklist. Pilots use checklists for a reason. It's mentally helps you get through a lot of the other pieces. So one of the things I really wanted to emphasize as part of what we're talking about is that from a user's perspective, authentication is part of the product experience they're having when they're using your product. It is they're one of their first experiences that they have when they're touching it. And so you really want to make sure that it is representative of the experience you want them to have and associate with using your product. And the reason that that's significant is because passkeys really are changing what authentication is going to look like for modern companies. It's actually very disruptive technology. And one of the reasons for that is because it changes the trade-offs that we have had to make historically around user experience versus security risk. But as we're moving towards this, one of the things to keep in mind is that you should not be using passkeys by themselves. We have learned that multi-factor authentication is more secure than only having one security factor. So just because we have a better, more effective security factor in the first place doesn't negate the need for having multiple authentication factors. So we still want to increase the belief and identity that by using that second factor. And what that means is that MFA really needs to become part of our authentication strategy, because how we are using that second factor can really make or break that user experience improvement we've gained from using passkeys. And so every being a factor, you're adding friction to your users. And depending on how badly they want to use your app, you can lose them because of that. So if you're adding this authentication layer that makes it a better experience for them, you want to make sure that that next factor continues that experience. So some of the ways that you might do that, besides just thinking through from their perspective, what is it going to be like to stop what they're doing now, open an authenticator app, enter a PIN code, but maybe there's some other ways to approach it. For example, if someone uses a passkey to log in, maybe I can get my second factor from a context signal. Maybe I can use their IP address or something that I already know about them. Or maybe it's okay to have a little bit less security during that initial login, and then I have another factor of authentication when they go to take a high-risk action, such as turning off a subscription or deleting something. But this MFA really becomes kind of the centerpiece for creating a really good user experience. So it's important as part of your strategy.
As a big Lord of the Rings fan, I really appreciated that slide. So again, kind of taking it from the customer perspective, but as you scale your business, it's really important that you also scale your identity and access management strategy. And I'm just going to explain what exactly that means. When your business gets bigger and bigger, right, usually that comes in two areas. It comes with different customers, oftentimes bigger customers, enterprise customers with bigger requirements. And that also then will come down to expanding your product, having different pieces of the product that need different types of access management. You can go on down to the next slide, Taylor. And so these different access controls need to become probably stricter. The more sensitive data you have, the better it needs to be protected. And you need to, as you get bigger and bigger, right? Once you have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 customers, and I say that like it's a large number, but I know for some we're talking thousands, if not millions. It's not possible to necessarily make maybe roles or groups for each of these customers individually. Then you need to start delegating some of these controls to their customers, to your customers, which has its own complexity to it, right? We're talking in this case about maybe I want to allow an admin in my customer to delegate different types of either provisioning or access management control to their users or their their employees, another member of the team over there. So what you're doing in that case is not just saying, okay, here's how I'm going to provision, but you have to be extra careful with that administrator that you're giving them permissions kind of over how your product is used by other members of their company. Furthermore, as they're authenticating, you need to make sure that your auth experience is good, that you're not getting stuck in friction, that we have a strong belief of who your identity is. And as much MFA as you want to have, you need to consider, where is that MFA important? Maybe it's important when logging in. Again, maybe I can pick parts of my application where I only need MFA if I'm accessing this part of the application, because this includes sensitive data. So you can scale up your authentication and your IAM strategy in a way that's a little bit more focused as to not cause friction. And then finally, you need to make sure that you have very comprehensive monitoring and auditing, right? It means that everything should be logged, especially on a tenant level or on an account level. When you're looking at your customers, you want every piece to be logged in there so you can monitor it, so you can help them with reporting, you can track their activities, and you can notify them when identity threats come up. As cybersecurity companies, it's oftentimes our responsibility to be the person ringing the alarm. And that means having strong identification from that monitoring. And as you get larger, right, managing it is going to get harder. This is more a summary of what I said. As your app gets bigger over time, you're going to have more users and resources. Also, your attack surface expands. This isn't a surprise to anyone, but you're going to get ransomware threats, phishing, hackers with better capabilities. And you're also going to have more compliances. More customers means more compliances. More customers means more countries with their own different levels of compliances. And it's something Taylor and I have experienced ourselves firsthand, but it's a piece that you just can't avoid as you grow. Back over to you, Taylor.
Yep. So we're a little bit over, so I'm going to go through these remaining slides pretty quick because we did have some questions we wanted to be able to cover with y'all. So one of the things I wanted to mention again was that the authentication user experience directly impacts your growth. Generally speaking, there's this trade-off that occurs between how secure your application is, the level of risk, and the experience that your user is having. There's a lot of different authentication factors to choose from. Make sure you're using ones that give your users flexibility, but strike the right balance between that experience and between the level of risk. Remember that introducing friction comes at a cost to your users, and make sure that you're not gatekeeping your signups. You want to make it easy for them to get in. Some of the key takeaways: make sure that you're treating your authentication as a product experience. You should be optimizing for that user experience by balancing your authentication need with your level of risk. We recommend adopting passwordless like as soon as possible. It's happening now. Don't miss it. Make sure you're only adding friction when you need it. And other key takeaways: making sure that you have a holistic IAM strategy. Access management is really hard to get right. You're probably not always going to get it right. So be willing to iterate, be willing to learn. Make sure that you have a good understanding of your requirements, and that you're considering kind of where the decision points around authorization are being made in your system, because you have to factor in things like latency, things like flexibility. And remember that MFA is critical to your overall IAM strategy. It's kind of the centerpiece for where you have the opportunity to reduce friction, but you also want to make sure that you have the appropriate level of security that you need, that customers have the flexibility to choose from the MFA mechanisms they want to use. So we recommend having a baseline MFA for high-risk actions. We recommend combining MFA where we recommend combining credentials with context where possible. And then we also recommend prompting for additional authentication for those high-risk steps. But yeah, thank y'all for listening. And we're ready for some questions now. So I'm going to turn off my slide share here. What's up, Jesse?
That was awesome, guys. As a practical example, while you're turning that off, we just did MFA. You know, Microsoft is actually implemented by the 11th, I think. So in 2 days, everyone using Office 365 has to do that. And we went with the IP address, the locale. So if you're locally here on campus, it actually saves you a step. So just a practical example of something recent, you know, in our area. So awesome stuff. We do have some questions, though. You guys ready?
All right, let's do it.
All right. So the first one is about strategy, right? How would you recommend approaching an authentication strategy?
Yeah, I'm happy to start off with that. The main thing that I would say, right, we had a couple of steps that we talked about before, but the number one is map it out. Start by looking at your user flow. My guess is you already have that done. It was part of a product process where you said, what are the different steps my user takes when accessing my application? From there, take a look and say, what pieces have critical data in them? Right. Once I'm saying there's a login, first of all, that's critical data because I need to understand who my user is and get their identity. Do I have any interesting user data anywhere else? Is my signup a part of that flow? Does my signup need to be gatekeeped in that way? So take your user flow, map out the areas that have critical data, and then see, okay, now that I have this kind of map of where I want things, what is the best authentication strategy for me? We recommend going with the passwordless kind. You can take passkeys, you could take a magic link, but you can also do a password if you want. Once you pick that, decide if I'm going to want to improve trust, which we see now, Google, Microsoft, it is not just being something that we say we recommend it. Now it's being required. So if you want to be a trustworthy application, you're going to need to add MFA. And then you need to say, okay, I'm adding MFA based on my initial authentication strategy. Which MFA strategy would I like to add that adds the least amount of friction? The example you gave, Jesse, is perfect. You know, to say something like people are on campus, it's MFA, but they don't have to do anything. It's a heck of a lot better than me taking out my phone, opening up an authenticator app, writing in the numbers, but not doing it fast enough where the phone has to refresh and I have to do it again. We've all been there.
Yeah. So it's a big deal.
That's what I would kind of say is a good way to approach it. Anything you want to add, Taylor?
Yeah, I think like authentication is a really strong case for like not reinventing the wheel. And like, as much as like we want you to purchase Frontegg because it's a great authentication platform, like there's a lot of reasons to outsource authentication just in general, because I think even if it's open source framework or a tool that you pay for, I think like what you're getting with that, what you're paying for is really the freedom to focus on your core business and trust that a lot of these other pieces are kind of 100%. Handled for you.
Yeah. Unless you want to be in that business. Yeah. Find something else. That's a great way to think about it. Any tips around migration? Like adopt a new technology when you've already got an app with existing users, right? That's a big concern.
Don't disrupt the users. Is the biggest thing. Is like you want to be very conscious of like making sure that your users' experience is protected. And then my only other short one is collaborate with the tool or tech that you're migrating to. They want you to be successful as much as you want to be successful. So just make sure that you're working together to reach a good solution. Hunter probably has some more practical tips, but those are my
it's also, you know, something that I work with on a regular basis when we're talking about migrating customers over to Frontegg, because we are a CIAM solution. Generally speaking, the number one thing is who is affected by this. Right? There's two cases. One, your company, because you're going to be more compliant, you're going to have better security. And number two is your users. So you have to decide how much friction is worth it for your users. Meaning if it's a one-time password reset, not that big of a deal. But perhaps as you're going, and if you're an enterprise company and you have a lot of SSO connections, oftentimes migrating to another provider means you're going to have to update each one of those SSOs. That is worth it a lot of the times, But if it's only a couple of customers, maybe it's not worth it, or vice versa. It's only a couple of customers, maybe it's worth it. Ultimately, your customers will need a level of communication in that process too. So that means that you're going to have to notify them, hey, all passwords are changing. Hey, we're migrating from passwordless to password, or hopefully the opposite. Hey, we're updating our SSO security. Customers will understand, but communication is key here, that you let them know so they don't come onto your website, see a completely different interface, or have to deal with things they never dealt with before. And especially if it feels like full of friction or buggy, they're going to start to lose trust in you. So really important, communication's key there.
All right, well, leading into communications, that's external. Let's talk internal, right? A lot of organizations, when they're bigger, there's a lot of people that are going to be stakeholders in any type of project like this. So what strategies would you recommend for communicating around these identity issues, which can be really complex, especially when talking with someone non-technical?
Ooh, can I take this one, Hunter?
Go for it.
Yes. So I think a lot of times what happens at large companies is identity concerns get very disconnected from the business value that they're actually responsible for. And so you have a lot of people making like business decisions, partnership decisions that are very disconnected from the technical side of things. And they don't understand why they're hitting the boundaries of these authorization implementations, why certain things aren't possible. And on the opposite end, you have engineers who are dealing with like very complex constraints around access controls in very large systems who don't understand the business value of what the work that they're doing either. And so I think beyond anything else, like structurally as an organization, trying to keep identity and identity concerns close to the core of like where the revenue is associated with, the engineering, where that's associated with. But in terms of communicating about it effectively internally, the folks that are going to be driving those decisions, especially when they're non-technical, aren't going to be won over by the technical side of things. You have to find a way for the narrative to be communicated such that it has to do with bottom line revenue. It has to do with security risk, compliance, that kind of thing, new opportunities that are opened. And so my suggestion is to, if possible, map the authorization or the authentication investments to partnership opportunities that are opened up or possibly already there, or to the security risk associated with not doing something. For example, having long-lived access tokens that never expire. So those are both effective. And then I think also anchoring to that user experience and the level of risk is like that's a very good way to communicate with non-technical folks about what the real implications there are.
And I'll just add one thing there, which is money. So you touched on it too, Taylor, but especially when we're talking about non-technical personas in a tech world, we're often talking about, right, sales team, CEOs, people, and the executive department. When you're going in that direction, especially let's talk compliance. More compliances, more potential customers. So that's like an easy way to start there when compliance is. And the opposite of that, poor security, higher churn. If a customer says, this is crap, I have these issues, they're affecting my users, especially in this B2B context that most cybersecurity companies find themselves, then they're going to leave you, they're going to churn, and it's going to have an effect.
And as an example, I mean, I was evaluating software just a week or so ago, and I asked them, how was their security posture? Were they GDPR compliant, CCPA, SOC 2, Type 2? I mean, those things that y'all just showed on there that are badges, people actually look for those.
Yep.
So
100%.
if you don't have them, you could churn revenue, not getting the customers is a big deal. Great answer. So another one, cybersecurity is, mostly B2B. How do you recommend solving for identity in multi-tenancy structures?
Sure. You want me to take that?
Big SaaS question, right?
Yeah. I'm going to hand that off to you, Hunter. So
to
me, I think one of the things that makes it very complex is the need to, like you spoke to this earlier, to delegate the controls and the authorization that you do have in place. Like, I think there's a lot of really fascinating use cases there. But yeah, Hunter.
Yeah, it's actually a great answer. I think, one of my favorite examples when I talk about multi-tenancy is a company like Slack. something most of us are familiar with. I log in under one email, but I can have multiple different workspaces. On one workspace, I might be an admin. On another workspace, I might be a generic user. That's a great example of multi-tenancy because those workspaces are not related at all. And the data on them should remain separate, even though I, as a user, can access both of them. So oftentimes when we're talking about B2B and scale B2B, especially nowadays when you have freelancing that is so big and different kind of developers who are coming on and working, you're going to end up with somebody who has an email that is used on multiple accounts. And you're going to have to deal with this idea of multi-tenancy, and access management is key there. When they log in, do you understand where they are navigating to? Of what context it is, what kind of permissions, access management they have per that context, and do you keep it in a place that is separate, right? Because you can't have all your data all together and be like, well, it's fine because, but if he looks at the developer tools and actually just fetches, sees the request that we're sending, he'll see the data from the other account too. Like, you're just opening yourself up for breaches and errors at that point. So the main thing, if you're going to look at multi-tenancy, it's a really easy plug for me to say something for Frontegg because we are one of the only IAM solutions that supports multi-tenancy. In general, work with somebody on it and keep the information separate. Make sure that you're not just saying I'm keeping information by user, because then if that user's accounts gets hacked, you now have two different clients that have a problem instead of just one. So keep that.
No commingling of data. Got it. All right. So talking about passkeys, right? And also big Lord of the Rings fan. You should not passkey. I thought that was awesome. But do you think they're going to actually replace passwords? I'm curious.
Yes, I do. Yeah, I mean, the cat's out of the bag. Like, people, if you look at biometrics in the phone, came out in 2013. Everyone uses those now. It is dead simple. Everyone has been conditioned to authenticate that way. It is natural and easy, and it removes the need for them to remember a password, to use a password manager. It eliminates risk. Like the fact that everyone has that on their phone, and then companies like Google are rolling that out to sign in with. Yeah, cat's out of the bag. Build passkeys, because if you don't, your competitors will, and they will grow and get users faster than you.
Got it. All right, so just a couple more, right? So, turning this a little bit around, want to talk a little bit about future, right? So what kind of trends are in this IAM space? What do you think is going to be happening over the rest of this year?
Yeah,
it's a good question. Go for it, Taylor.
I've got some theories, but Hunter, I'd love to hear yours first. I've already got mine written down. So.
Oh boy, so you're probably going to answer better than I will. I'll just say trends that I've noticed. Everyone and their mother is SOC 2 compliant at this point. If you're not, you're late in the game. So it is a hassle. I'm not going to lie. It is difficult, and not just SOC 2, right? We talked about SOC 2, CPAA, HIPAA, if you're talking in the medical environment, right? Every domain has its own compliances, and every country almost at this point also has its own compliances. And, as a practical example, we've had customers in countries where we haven't had a presence before, and they've said, oh, but, we need our data to be stored in country by country law. And, that was a case where we were like, oh, crap, like we need to figure that out. And luckily, we have an amazing dev team that was able to, spin up a DB where we needed it. But it's not that simple for a lot of companies. So do your best to get ahead in the game. In terms of where trends are going, you have compliances. We mentioned passkeys, but passwords really are getting less and less relevant, which I think is funny. And I'm really curious personally to see how password memory applications evolve to help with that, because that's what I want to see. How are, we have a whole sect of companies now that evolved around the password, and how are they going to change in this new namespace? That's a question I have. But Taylor, you want to tell us your theories?
Yes. So I have spent a lot of time thinking about this. I think that, like, one thing that's very positive is everything is getting easier and safer for the end user. And I think that's absolutely going to continue. I think the companies that really get it right and create an authentication experience that is good and like it creates a happy path for their end users are going to be the ones that really succeed over these next few years. And I think user expectations are going to shift towards that. They're going to, the norm for them is going to be these really easy authentication flows, and they're going to notice when you don't have that. On the business side, I think people with the growth of some of these fine-grained access controls, like there's more complexity there and more flexibility. But I think with a lot of the like ways that we have seen performance improving over these past few years around things like front-end frameworks, I think that mindset is going to carry over, and some of the performance considerations around access controls are going to go away. So that decision based on the policy will be very quick. And because of that, I think we're going to see this big shift towards provisioning that happens at runtime rather than kind of this more admin time provisioning, where you're defining those roles and things in advance. I think people are really going to start to lean into that.
Okay. All right. Last question. Right. Really, when you're thinking about authentication mechanism, I think about these things. So antiques maybe, but are authentication methods and mechanisms like typing on your keyboard, are they still safe?
No reason why they can't be. I mean, ultimately, I would suggest them as part of an auth strategy, right? Not as your only authentication mechanism. But what's really cool is that there are a lot of signals in our technology, in our day-to-day lives, that we don't think about that much. A perfect example of this is we're a big Google family, and I have Smart Unlock on my Google phone when I'm at home. It's the exact same thing as what we were talking about, MFA, that is IP-based. My phone has location services and knows that I'm in my home, so I don't need to unlock it. Same thing, like another great example is watch to phone here, right? That I also have Smart Unlock when my phone is in proximity of my watch. These are cases that we use when we think about devices, but kind of expand that in the sense of signals, right? You're going to be in a place where you have a lot more available, and the way you type is just another signal that you can add to the puzzle.
Got it. Well, Taylor, you want to add anything before we wrap this up?
I just am thinking about like how happy someone with a keylogger would be if your only authentication mechanism was like a keyboard. It'd be like, look, all these
this is a prop. I don't actually use it.
Yeah, right. We just have to say good morning.
But yeah, just having multiple factors is, like Hunter said.
Yeah, MFA is the way. And listen, thanks to both of y'all. That was awesome. Had a lot of fun watching, and then the Q&A session at the end. And thank you to everybody out there for joining us today. I trust you were able to take away some good practical advice on how to improve your identity and access management efforts and make them work better in your organization. Another big thanks to Hunter and Taylor from Frontegg, and for being so helpful and engaging today. Listen, if you want to share this webinar or view our other on-demand events, you can visit dzone.com/events, or for more information on Frontegg, just go to frontegg.com. See you next time.